Welcome into a new edition of Gophers Guru TV here on YouTube and available on gophersguru.com. Today, I'm really excited about the show. One of the hardest working Twin Cities media members is here today to talk Gophers football and basketball. He covers the University of Minnesota athletics and Minnesota United FC for the St. Paul Pioneer Press. Andy Greder is here, the great Andy Greder. You can check out his work on newsstands in the Pioneer Press or online by subscribing to his work on twincities.com. Andy, it's been a while. What's going on in your life?
Yeah, thanks for the shout out for the work I do. You're too kind. I don't know if great is the proper adjective. I'll take good. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's nice to join you again.
It's pretty close to football season, I guess. We're 85 days away, which honestly, I don't think that's all that far away. We had the chance to check out a little spring ball. From the action you saw, I'm just curious, what did you think of the team and what were your biggest takeaways?
Yeah, I think, just the sheer size of the roster. I mean, it's just such a weird dynamic to have 20 of 22 starters back, the super seniors that they have, the influx of half a dozen transfers, the early additions, the early enrollees, about a half a dozen there. Just the depth that they have, and I think that's going to be something that we're going to see throughout college football. But I think the Gophers are one of the most experienced teams, and you could just see the roster kind of taking shape before you have to go into fall camp. It was just a lot of guys out there, and you could really see where things stacked up.
Well, the offensive line is obviously going to be one of the most experienced position groups on the roster with now Daniel Falele and Curtis Dunlap coming back. You had guys that got experience last year in depth spots that can roll in like Axel Rushmeyer, people like that. And then John Michael Schmitz, who is one of the most underrated centers in the Big Ten, I believe. And then you also look at like Ariante Ursary, another guy that got depth snaps last year. So, I mean, they have a lot. And Sam Schluter coming back as well. Another veteran who felt like he's been here for a long time. So, and Connor Olson, they're loaded up on the offensive line with experience. You have to wonder about that offensive identity, what it's going to look like. Last year they skewed toward the run. Do they become more balanced this season? What's your take on the offense and what it could look like this season as Mike Sanford Jr. actually has a normal offseason here?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the offensive line. I know that there was a listserv put out by sports information directors about who has the most experienced offensive line, and I don't know exactly what the response rate to that was, but the Gophers came in first on that list with the 160 combined starts and just an amazing amount of experience up front and two quality two deeps that you can plug in a lot of spots. Obviously, Lele's return is literally massive and figuratively massive for that offensive line. And yeah, I think just, some versatility. One guy you didn't mention was Blaze Andrews, who's played a lot of football and played a lot of different spots and done it at a high level. So, yeah, I mean, when you're overlooking guys that have played, 33, college football games like Blaze, it just shows you all the different options that they have there. Yeah, I mean, what the identity of the offense is going to be is going to be, one of the biggest storylines going into the fall. Obviously, Mohamed Ibrahim, was the Big Ten running back of the year and, had just an amazing workload, probably an outsized workload, too much in my opinion. And, asked PJ Fleck about that a couple of weeks ago. And he's like, yeah, he's going to play a lot. We're going to give him the ball all the time. And, a few years ago, PJ was, kind of taken to the pair and a spare approach of multiple running backs and keeping guys fresh. And this year it's very much, Mo Ibrahim is going to be the workhorse running back. And that can be a little concerning because, he was dinged up at times last year and wasn't able to go just because of the workload. And that's something that you're going to have at that position. And it's not like they don't have quality guys behind him. Trey Potts, I think, can really do some things and be a quality player for him. So, yeah, I mean, back to the identity of the team, without Rashad Bateman, you're going to, see, stacked boxes more often than not. Mm-hmm. And you're going to have to keep defenses honest. And if you're going to, feed it to Mo behind that offensive line as much as the Gophers say they're going to, Are they going to have enough on the outside to keep defenses honest is going to be, like I said, one of the biggest storylines going into the fall.
What you touched on there, I think, is the most important thing about the Gophers offense. You watch 2019, the difference between the 2019 and 2020 offense is, like you said, those stacked boxes. Minnesota was able to push the ball vertically, and they did a nice job setting up their passing concept. So they're running that RPO and forcing teams to have to sit on those routes to try to defend them. And then eventually they're opening it up with play action vertically and taking shots. And last season, there wasn't that balance between that, the buildup of those passing concepts, and then being able to run into lighter boxes because teams need to take away the pass and cover you vertically. Some of that was due to personnel. I didn't think the receiver room was as strong, and that's one of the question marks that I have entering the season is who emerges as that wide receiver 3. Is it Mike Brown-Stevens? I've heard a lot of good things about him possibly being a really dynamic slot guy in Mike Sanford's offense and him becoming more involved. Brady Boyd's another guy that caught my eye during this limited spring action that we saw. He looked physically ready, like he could play, and his film was really good. He's a solid route runner. I'm curious to get your take on the passing game and who do you think could emerge at wide receiver as the third option?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a few there. I think we're waiting to see what Dalen Wright can do, the transfer from Texas A&M. I think if we look at, kind of the biggest disappointments of the spring game was the fact that he wasn't able to play.
Right.
I think that, it was interesting to hear Fleck and Sanford and Tanner Morgan talk about him. And, they were excited by him, but also kind of hedged a little bit and talking about maybe how raw he was or how he needed to kind of have a better, more open mindset to kind of learning and growing. And I think that he was a guy that I think was looked at as, just given his pedigree and where he was coming from at Texas A&M, that could he be a guy that steps into that role? He also is a different build of wide receiver, kind of longer, taller than what they have already in that room. Yeah, I mean, I think the questions also go to Daniel Jackson. I think that we saw him make some plays at times, but it wasn't as consistent as you need to see in a number 2 wide receiver. So while there are questions of who's going to be number 3, are we going to see Daniel Jackson step up into, fully fledged number 2? And, as Gopher fans know for a number of years now, are we going to throw the ball to the tight ends? Is that going to be an option? Is that going to be, kind of a threat in the passing game as well? And we heard from Fleck and we heard from Sanford that was going to be what they did, but it didn't come to fruition last year. And I know some injuries at that spot, especially to Brevin Spanford, limited what he, could do and the role that he could play. So is he going to be healthy? And is that going to be another facet to the passing game that kind of maybe takes away from what you're expecting from the third wide receiver?
Yeah, the tight end room has a lot of experience coming back. Like seriously, Bryce Whittam's been at Minnesota forever, so they do have Keith and other options there. Maybe not as nuanced in the passing game, but like, is this the year that Brevin Spanford stays healthy and becomes a legitimate threat? The wide receiver room could be helped out by the tight end group as well. I think that's a really good point that you're making there. And if I had a dime for every time someone sent me a message about a tight end and the Gophers, I'd be a millionaire, because ever since PJ's been here, that's the one thing that everyone is constantly asking me about. I'm sure you experienced that too.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, some of this is kind of undue on Sanford just because that's what Chiraka was lacking so much, right? So we're kind of putting some expectation on Sanford that is kind of carried over from what Chiraka wasn't doing. So yeah, I think we need to see more from that spot, especially given the fact that there isn't, multiple wide receivers that we've had in previous years.
Well, and you look at this team last year, Andy, obviously the biggest problem was on the defensive side of the ball. Unable to stop the run, explosive plays galore. Minnesota was one of the worst teams in the country at getting the third down. It was just awful to watch some of the defensive performances. I thought they got better as the season progressed, and you saw some growth, and it centered around that run defense, being able to control a gap, get off of blocks inside. and then eventually get them into third and long situations. And that's where Rossi takes over with blitzing and being able to be creative. But I think it stems from starting to get some pressure with four-man fronts. And you look at the defense last year, being able to get some of those younger guys reps last season, that had less experience. That was probably beneficial for the future. I'm curious what you think. Do you think that playing time that those younger and less experienced defensive players gain will help the defense this year and add more depth to that roster?
Yeah, for sure. I think just losing 7 starters like they did from 2019 and 4 draft picks was just huge for this program. I mean, this isn't Ohio State. This isn't a top defense in the country that can just plug and play right away. I think we kind of expected them to keep the same level as 19, and I don't think that was fair to them, just given how many changes that they had to make, right? And do it without a spring ball, and do it with a stop and start fall of, are you going to play or aren't you? And I think we saw that especially early in the Michigan game, and oh my God, against Maryland, how brutal that was when they almost gave up 700 yards in that game. It was just floodgates a lot of times. It reminded me of the Illinois game in 2018, where they just got out of the chute left and right, and breakdowns so often. Yeah, I think definitely Mariano Sarimarin must take the next step, and that's why Jack Gibbons was brought in case he doesn't, because of what he struggled with last year. I think he was also, it seemed a little bit slow. I think the idea was, he was trying to do too much. And I think some of that was, kind of coaches covering for him a little bit. And he, just wasn't doing enough at his own right, even if he was in the right spot. And he has to obviously take the next step. He's the guy that must improve the most in that defense. I think one concerning piece for me was, Jordan Howden has played a fair amount of football here, and he was one of the guys that was breaking down the most. I think Tyler Nubin, in his, first, collegiate experience filling in for Antoine Winfield Jr., I think we can definitely swallow the fact that there was, a learning curve for him, but Jordan Howden making the mistakes and having be a guy that is experienced in his third year of college football was a little bit more concerning, that he wasn't kind of the rock that they needed in the back of that secondary.
It's a really good point. I don't think people talked enough about safety play last season, and it's something that definitely has to get better. And I've always said, and I wrote a lot of articles about, it's a layered effect. The defensive tackle gets out of a gap and full run fit by the linebacker, and then you got a third level play that's just nearly impossible for your safety. So it's hard to sometimes quantify safety play just because of the defensive issues. However, I do have concerns about, do those guys take the next step? And I've often wondered, does Stephen Ortiz become a guy here, if he adjusts well, maybe flashes over and goes to safety? I don't know, but he's probably a better nickel cornerback, and that's probably the role he'll play. But if you got into a pinch, I would be surprised if that happened. And also, Andy, one of the big things that I have questions about is a cornerback room. What do you think right now about the current state of things? Do the Gophers still look to possibly bring in a cornerback opposite Coney Durr that can be a lockdown option?
Yeah, just touching on safeties again, I think if Dylan Wright was the disappointment on offense, the absence of Michael Dixon on defense was something that I think hurt as well, just because he was a true freshman who they raved about last year and got some snaps back there, and
really good.
Yeah, and I think is a promising young player that his inability to play this spring was a letdown, I think, for the depth of that defense and at that safety spot. Yeah, I mean, cornerback is the biggest concern on that defense. I mean, Benjamin St-Juste and Coney Durr have locked down those two spots for a few years now, and I think the Gophers, must be counting their lucky stars, the fact that Coney Durr came back and didn't move on to the next level, just because losing both cornerbacks would have been devastating. And we're seeing what's going on with the offers and interest that they're putting out to guys in the transfer portal. And that's something that's been consistent for months now. And even up into this week with the guy from Kansas that they're showing interest in. Yeah, I think you can just read the tea leaves and see that they are not confident in what they have in that room to be as active as they are in the transfer portal at that spot. I think Terrell Smith was a guy that played as a true freshman and had took his lumps and kind of went to a reserve role over the last few years, and I think had some opportunities and some flashes in the spring game that I think are encouraging. And they talked about him, playing his best football this spring, and Phil Howard has experience there as well. And Miles Fleming, I think, that is a guy that they like there. Justin Wally as well.
Really good, yeah.
Showed some plum.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I think there's some young guys there at that spot and some older guys that maybe can fill in. But just given their commitment to try to plug through the portal at that position group, I think shows that within that football complex, they still feel like they have needs there, and I think that all Gopher fans should, in accord, look at that with a concerning eye.
The quarterback position with Karan Prunty from Kansas hitting the transfer portal, as Andy mentioned, someone that I'm really interested in, watched a lot of last season, 3 games, and I said, this guy is definitely a future NFL talent, someone to keep an eye on down the road. Lots of length, speed, was aggressive on the football, 10 pass breakups, had some of the most pass breakups among freshmen in the country. I look at what that could do for the future depth chart as well. When Cody Durr leaves after this season, then Karan Prunty with Justin Wally and Stephen Ortiz Jr., you'd have a nice core of cornerbacks moving forward with some eligibility available. That's why I do think that the Gophers are going to look to add another cornerback that can be a lockdown option to replace Benjamin St. Juste opposite of Cody Durr. And they're going to need it week 1. Ohio State coming to town, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson. First game is not going to be easing into the season at all. You got one of the most explosive passing attacks in the country coming to town. Andy, I want to shift to basketball a little bit. A lot of things have happened since the end of last season. Got a little crazy. Richard Pitino parted ways with Minnesota, parted ways with Richard Pitino. Ben Johnson gets hired. I just want to get your reaction about Ben Johnson getting hired. What ran through your mind initially when you heard he was the hired? Were you a little bit surprised or not?
Well, I think once it started to come out a day or two before that he was part of the mix,
Mm-hmm.
I initially felt like, hey, I guess I should have thought about this a little bit more, just because I equated it to something similar with Lindsey Whalen, right? Like Mark Coyle was willing to hire somebody that has no head coaching experience and come into the Big Ten. I think he was willing to kind of go outside of the mold of a sitting coach at a lower level. And I think that was something that, hey, I guess I should have thought of a little bit more in hindsight, that he wasn't just going to do something of an established coach. But I think that is something that is going to be part of his learning curve. I think we've seen it with Whalen, is there is an adjustment period to being the guy on the sidelines. And I think Ben is maybe a little bit more ready than Lindsey was, just because Ben has been a career assistant for, 15, 16 years or so. So he's been kind of groomed for this spot, and Lindsey was a little bit more raw coming straight from the court. So yeah, I think there was a little bit of a surprise that it wasn't some of the guys that, like Craig Smith type, Dennis Gates, somebody that kind of had experience, like I said. So I think that's going to be something that we're going to have to watch closely over the next season, is how kind of does he transition to being the top guy.
And as I said when he got hired, he really needed to nail this coaching staff, especially since he doesn't have any head coaching experience. And
yeah,
I mean, being an assistant for a long time, he knows the basketball X's and O's. There's no question about that. He can handle it. It's the in-game stuff. It's some of the things about managing a program that could be a challenge. But I really like what he did with his staff. I was impressed when we had the chance to talk with some of the assistants and just looking into their backgrounds more. I think Dave Thorson brings that experience, the defensive expertise, really phenomenal connections in the Twin Cities basketball scene. And then you got Jason Kemp, who's known for player development. Marcus Jenkins, more of an offensive-minded coach. who can help on that end of the court. So you got an offensive and a defensive-minded coach and then a player development guy. I'm just curious, what did you think about Ben Johnson's coaching staff when you had a chance to talk with them and look at their backgrounds a bit?
Yeah, I think Dave Thorson is I think probably the linchpin of this staff, just given the relationship that he has with Ben from being his coach at De La Salle and working with him so long there and knowing him for 20 plus years. I think that's going to be something that Ben's going to rely on how to run a program, and Dave Thorson has certainly done it at a lot of places for himself at De La Salle and as assistant at Minnesota and Colorado State and elsewhere. So I think that's probably the most important one on the staff. I think just the connections that those guys have in Minnesota will be very important, and Marcus Jenkins, being an offensive minded coordinator, if you will. I think Ben kind of sees things that he wants to do on that side of the court, and Marcus will certainly aid in that. And Jason Kemp, has some experience with developing players, and I think that'll be vital as well.
It's going to be key moving forward, especially when you see all the roster turnover the Gophers have. You look at the numbers right now; they're 4.6% returning minutes percentage is the lowest among Power 5 schools, and only one non-power program, Tennessee Martin, has less returning minutes coming back next season. Isaiah Enan's the only returning player from last year's roster. Andy, do you think it's easier or more difficult to patch this roster since players are more readily available in the transfer portal? I've been thinking a lot about that, and I want to get your opinion on it.
I mean, I just think it's stunning the exodus that they've had. I mean, just to see so many guys leave, it's just startling that it's not, there isn't a core of a few guys that are coming back. And Isaiah Enan, to his credit, is sticking with it, coming over from Germany and not having other connections here. If there was a short list of guys that you would think maybe could go, just Isaiah Enan's, European background, you think, okay, maybe he would be a guy that would leave, but to be the guy that's coming back, I think is surprising. I think it's easier to plug the roster, but then again, are you getting the right guys? Are you getting the guys that can move the needle? There's a lot of guys that they're bringing in here that are lower level, mid-major types that they're expecting, or junior college types or Division II guys. I know, Parker Fox is injured, but they're asking a lot of guys to step up to the Big Ten level and play right away and contribute right away and make that transition. And I think it's concerning to have that high of expectation for so many guys that haven't done it before. And I think that, you also look at the roster and you're like, who's going to be the difference maker? Who's going to be the go-to guy? And it's concerning because I don't know who that person is. Obviously, Marcus Carr and Liam Robbins, those guys were asked to do a lot at a lot of times last year. And I don't see those guys on this roster currently of who's going to be the go-to guys when it matters. And I think that's concerning.
Jamison Battle's the one guy I think could be the underrated player that they landed. Good shooter, versatile, can help a lot on the offensive end. That's the one thing that I noticed with Ben Johnson's recruiting here is the shooting that he's been prioritizing. And I've talked a lot about that. Richard Pitino, 6 years in a row with effective field goal percentages below 50%. You have to get above 50% to be able to compete against some of this top talent. You see it in the NBA right now. Brooklyn, high-paced, offensive explosion, but the other teams can't keep up with it. They have the premier shooting, and I think that translates across basketball right now because the skill level is just so good from all these players across the country that shooting matters the most. And I'm keeping an eye on that big man spot. Who's going to be a center that they can land here in the next couple of weeks just to solidify that? Because Trey Thompson's literally your only center right now. I do think they're going to play more of a spread offense like they ran at Xavier, where you're moving the ball and your guards, you're playing a little bit smaller and you're spacing the floor and cuts and movement off ball and having that versatile big. I'm keeping an eye on Sterling Manley from North Carolina transfer. He could possibly be a guy they target if he indeed wants to continue playing college basketball. Andy, I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts on in-state recruiting. And I know Mark Quill talked a lot about this as being one of the things that he prioritized the most during the hiring process. What was the reaction like from people you talked with in the basketball community after the Gophers hired Ben? Do you think this moved the needle in the eyes of some of those people?
Yeah, I do. I think, it's recruiting is so much about relationships. And I think, kind of initially with what we saw from Richard Coffey about Amir Coffey's recruiting, from what Daniel Arturu said about the role that Ben Johnson had in his decision to stay home in Minnesota, I think you could see right away how important Ben Johnson was to local recruiting. So yeah, I think that's going to be vital because there's a lot of players in this 2022 class. It's kind of starting with Trey Holloman and what happens with him. I know he was a priority for them once the dead period ended at the start of June, and kind of on down the list of guys that they want to have in that 22 class, because I think, this next season is going to be kind of a soft opening, if you will. This is going to be a kind of a grace period that Ben Johnson's certainly going to have, because the roster is certainly going to be under construction for a while, just given the massive exodus that they had and how they're trying to, plug gaps with things through the transfer portal. So, kind of having guys come in that are, 4-star type recruits that are younger, that buy into what Ben is and what he's trying to build here, and do things kind of at a foundational level will be important going forward.
That's the big thing. The 2022 recruiting class is going to be the thing that Ben is really judged on through the eyes of fans, I think. Is he able to get a couple of those big fishes in the Minnesota pond? Which players do you think are realistic targets for Ben in this class of 2022?
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned one of them with Trey Holloman, the Cretan Durham Hall point guard. I think he's at the top of the list. Braden Carrington is another guy that I think, they really want. Camden Heide from Wyzetta is another guy, a good shooter, a guy that I think that can play at the next level and is one of the best in the state. So I think there's, Anjay Lee. There's quite a few guys that I think they're going to be targeting in the state, and it'll be interesting to see how many of those they can get. Trey Holloman, was at Michigan State here this last week and was posting quite a few photos of him with Izzo and Mel Tucker, and it seemed like he had a quality time in East Lansing, and I know PJ Fleck is interested in that as well. So they don't want to see him leave for multiple programs in Minnesota.
The interesting thing was Trey Holloman participated in the camp last week, and he was there after doing a basketball visit. So not only at basketball with Minnesota, but participating in football camp, then goes to Michigan State. But yes, it did sound like Michigan State visit went really well, and Holloman liked what he saw, and his mom posted a tweet about it, just talking about Tom Izzo and the way he runs this program. So that will be something that's interesting to watch. Another guy I'm keeping an eye on the list that you mentioned is Demarion Watson, Salisbury from Totino Grace, a guy that's got really good length, good rebounder, solid on the defensive end. Another guy that Ben Johnson and his staff are definitely keeping an eye on and will head in for a visit already. Definitely someone that could be a realistic target. Andy, as always, that was a lot of fun. I want to give you an opportunity to plug some of the content that you're going to have out on the St. Paul Pioneer Press, on newsstands and online in the coming weeks here.
Yeah, coming soon, with football recruiting ramping up, I got a feature on Jacob Knuth, the new quarterback in the 2022 class, about who he is, what he's about, kind of his rise and kind of being overlooked coming out of South Dakota. So that'll be something that I'll be in the newspaper here over the next couple of days.
You can follow Andy on Twitter at Andy Greder and read his articles in the Pioneer Press or on twincities.com. I just can't stress enough how hard this guy works. I mean, he brings you guys coverage. He's doing multiple things, basketball, football, soccer, everything, and he's just a great guy. Please support his work. Andy, thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks, House. Take care, man.